I was the golden child, until I realized that it was all a lie. I always thought I had it all figured out. I was the perfect child, the one who followed the rules, earned straight A's, played the piano like a prodigy, and never gave my parents a reason to worry. In comparison, my brother was the problem child. He skipped school, smoked weed in the backyard, got into fights, and made poor decisions at every turn. From the outside, our family seemed pretty typical. 2 kids, 2 parents, and the typical sibling rivalry. But to me, it always felt like the rivalry was a little one-sided. From the moment I could remember, my parents would shower me with praise. "You're going to make something of yourself, sweetie," they'd say, beaming with pride. It wasn't just about the grades or the piano recitals. It was about the way they treated me like the golden child, the one they believed had everything they ever wanted in a kid. They'd tell all their friends how proud they were of me, how lucky they were to have me, and how I was going to be successful. My brother, on the other hand, was the constant disappointment, the screw-up. He'd flunk his classes, he'd get into trouble with the law, and no matter what he did, it was never good enough. At first, I didn't really think much about it. I was young, and I just wanted to please my parents. I tried my hardest to be the good child, because being the good child was what made them happy. But over the years, I began to see the difference in the way they treated me and the way they treated him. I started to see that there were unspoken rules I was supposed to follow to maintain this image they built around me. And it wasn't long before I realized how deeply it had affected me. My brother wasn't stupid. He knew how my parents felt about him. He could see it in their eyes when they looked at him with disappointment, and he could feel it in the way they held me on this pedestal while they constantly berated him. For a long time, I didn't understand why he acted the way he did. He was reckless, defiant, and angry at the world. He lashed out in every direction, and I just couldn't understand why. Then came the day it all changed. I remember it like it was yesterday. My brother got into trouble again. This time, with something serious. He was arrested for drugs, and the situation was a mess. It wasn't his first time in trouble, but this was different. This time, the consequences were far worse. The drugs he was caught with were not the kind you could just brush under the rug. It felt like the moment everything would finally catch up to him. But when my parents found out, they didn't react the way I expected. They weren't angry. They weren't upset. They didn't scream or cry or try to discipline him. They just sat there, almost numb, as if they had already prepared themselves for this moment. I was shocked. The usual routine was to get mad, to lecture him, to make him feel like he was ruining their lives. But this time, they didn't. They weren't even disappointed. They weren't even surprised. That's when it hit me. The realization that I had been living a lie for years. I wasn't the golden child. I'd spent my entire life striving to meet their impossible standards, thinking that if I was perfect enough, they would love me the most. But the truth was, I wasn't the one they cared about the most. I wasn't the one they had invested all their hopes and dreams into. I wasn't the one who had their hearts. My brother was. Even with all his faults, he was the one they secretly favored. They kept telling me I was the responsible one, the one who had it all together, but deep down, they were always relying on me to be the one who held everything together when he inevitably messed up. I was the backup, the safety net. I wasn't the child they adored. I was just the child who could fix everything for them. I spent a lot of time reflecting on it. How had I not seen this sooner? How had I been blind to what was happening right in front of me? And how could they have kept this secret for so long? I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that weighed on my chest. It was like everything I'd worked for. The hours spent studying, the time I spent making sure everything in my life was perfect, meant nothing. They never saw me. They never cared about what I wanted or what I needed. It was always about my brother. They were always so consumed with the idea that he had potential to do great things, while I was just supposed to be the good, obedient child who made them look good. I could have confronted them. I should have confronted them, but I didn't. I didn't know how to begin. How do you talk to your parents when you realize everything you've worked for has been nothing more than a role you were forced to play? How do you tell them that the pedestal they put you on is just as suffocating as the one they kept your brother under? Instead, I did what I always did. I kept my emotions buried deep inside, pretending that everything was fine. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was strong enough to handle it, that I was strong enough to handle anything. But the truth was, I wasn't. And the worst part? I was too scared to leave. I couldn't walk away from everything I had known, from the life I had built for myself. But I also knew I couldn't stay forever. The realization hit me harder than anything. I wasn't the golden child. I was just the backup, the safety net, the one who would always be there to clean up the mess. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of here. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I left, I'd be abandoning my brother. I didn't want him to feel alone. I didn't want to be the one who turned my back on him. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that he didn't need me the way I had always thought. He was an adult now. He had his own life, and I had mine. But if I left, what would I even be leaving behind? Would it be worth it? I kept asking myself if I was making a mistake. Was I wrong to want something more than this? Was I wrong to want to escape the role they had forced me into? And the worst part? I still didn't know if I was strong enough to leave. So, after everything happened with my brother, I kept thinking, maybe this was the wake-up call I needed. I didn't have to keep playing this role, right? I could walk away, break free, and start fresh. But that nagging feeling that I might be abandoning my family, or worse, leaving my brother to fend for himself, kept me up at night. I guess that's when the real conflict started. I realized something even deeper. I didn't really know who I was outside of being the good child. My whole identity had been built on this image of perfection, the image my parents wanted to see. The kid who followed the rules, who got good grades, who made them look good. And for years, I'd been doing that because, honestly, I didn't know how to be anything else. But now that everything felt like it was falling apart, I had to ask myself, was I doing all this for them, or was I doing it for me? I started looking at things from a different angle. My brother had always been the one who didn't care. He didn't care about their expectations, didn't care about the consequences of his actions. Maybe he was onto something. Maybe the only way to really live was to stop pretending, to stop trying to fit into a mold that wasn't meant for me. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like I had two options. I could stay and keep playing this perfect role forever, keeping my family happy and sacrificing my own happiness, or I could leave and find out who I really was without all of their expectations hanging over me. I couldn't stop thinking about the moment when I realized the truth about my parents. I wasn't the golden child. I was just the backup. I wasn't the one they truly cared about. I was just the one who was always there to clean up the mess when everything went wrong. And my brother, for all his flaws, was the one they were always secretly hoping would turn it around. They were holding on to some idea that if they just gave him enough chances, he'd finally become the person they always believed he could be. But I wasn't sure if I could keep being their backup anymore. The weight of all that responsibility was crushing me, and I couldn't ignore the fact that I was living a life that wasn't mine. A life that had been handed to me by my parents, one decision at a time. I remember sitting in my room one night, staring at the wall, just thinking about everything. My phone buzzed. It was my mom. She was calling to check in, to see if I was okay after the whole situation with my brother. And the moment I saw her name on the screen, I knew exactly what this was. It was her asking if I was going to keep holding the family together. It was her making sure I was still willing to play my role as the responsible one. And for a moment, I hesitated. I almost picked up the phone, ready to tell her everything. How I was done with being the perfect child. How I was tired of living for them. How I needed to figure out who I was. But then I thought about my brother. I thought about how he'd been in trouble before, how he'd needed help, and how I'd always been the one to save him. I didn't pick up the phone. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe I was scared. Maybe I just didn't know how to tell her the truth without feeling like I was betraying everything I'd ever known. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, not school, not work, not even hanging out with friends. I was consumed with this overwhelming feeling of being stuck. I wanted to leave, to finally make a choice that was just for me, but something kept holding me back. It felt like if I left, I would be abandoning everyone, like I would be walking away from my family, my responsibilities, and everything I had ever known. But then something unexpected happened. My brother, the same guy who had always been a mess, the one who couldn't be counted on for anything, showed up at my door one night. I wasn't expecting him. I didn't even know how he'd found me. But there he was, standing in front of me, looking like a completely different person. He looked sober. And for the first time in forever, he didn't have that usual look of rebellion in his eyes. Instead, he looked tired, defeated, but also determined. "I need your help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know why, but for the first time in years, I felt like he wasn't asking for something he could easily get from someone else. He wasn't asking for my forgiveness or for me to fix his mess. He was asking for help, as if he knew he needed to change. And that was the moment I realized something. My brother didn't need me to be his backup anymore. He was finally ready to fight for himself. But now I had to make a choice. If I helped him, would that mean I was staying in my role? Would I always be the one who had to save everyone? Or was this the moment I could finally break free and start living for myself? I couldn't tell him that I was done, that I couldn't help him anymore. I didn't know how to say that out loud. But I also couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. So I told him the truth. I can't keep doing this for you. I'm sorry. You have to do this on your own. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, staring at me like he didn't know what to do with the words I'd just spoken. And honestly, I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. I didn't know if I was abandoning him, or if I was just finally letting him grow up. But in that moment, I realized something important. It wasn't my job to fix everything. It wasn't my responsibility to hold everyone's broken pieces together. I had my own life to live. And just like that, it felt like everything was changing. The weight I'd been carrying for so long, the one that had always made me feel like I had to be perfect, like I had to be the one to fix everything. Suddenly, it wasn't there anymore. I wasn't the golden child. I wasn't the backup anymore. And I didn't know what was next. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to have all the answers.